When we watch men in uniform on screen, don't emotions of pride and respect overwhelm you? For years now, films based on the Indian Armed Forces have been an audience's favorite. But now, with the mode of entertainment shifting towards OTT platforms, there are ample examples of stories based on or revolving around the armed forces that are being showcased there. However, some of these movies or web series have invoked a strong reaction from those who have served the forces for distorting the image of our defense institutions.
With creative license is fine. But why is it that the creative license is every time exploited to give a negative image to the armed forces?
Any military officer, if he had been an advisor, in this case an Air Force officer, he would have not let them go into these small inaccuracies.
The OTT component cannot be allowed to become a dark web of entertainment.
Disrespecting Indian Army, Indian Air Force is not in good taste, and it's setting very bad precedents.
On December 9, 2020, the Indian Air Force criticized Netflix India, Bollywood actor Anil Kapoor and filmmaker Anurag Kashyap for inaccurately presenting the Air Force uniform in the trailer of a film AK vs AK, which is scheduled for a release on the OTT platform on December 24th. In a strongly worded tweet, the Indian Air Force said the uniform in the video is inaccurately donned and the language used is inappropriate. Demanding that these scenes be withdrawn, the Air Force has said, this does not conform to the behavioral norms of those in the armed forces of India.
Look, it is becoming a very worrying trend and it is becoming far too recurrent for comfort. In fact, one is led to speculate whether there is a specific agenda to run down the institutions of this country, the armed forces of this country, defame them, give them a bad name, spoil their perception, public perception, and demonize them.
The kind of uniform he's wearing, whether it's the color, the way he's wearing the shirt, some of the things which are worn by him in uniform are incorrect. Any military officer, if he had been an advisor, in this case an Air Force officer, he would have not let them go into these small inaccuracies. But the worst part thereafter is the kind of language that this officer, so-called officer, is speaking. He's supposed to be an air commodore. It's a very senior rank. It's a brigadier rank officer. And, we don't speak such language. And that's the last thing that we want anybody to depict about Indian Armed Forces.
Although Netflix India and Anil Kapoor were quick to issue an apology, netizens went berserk with people asking if OTT platforms or movie makers are taking way too much creative liberty with the Indian Armed Forces.
AK versus AK. No serving armed forces officer will behave in an unkempt manner, wearing a top tunic with full decorations and badges of rank, and an unkempt beard, not shaven, hair tousled, and then using the kind of language that has been used. There are limits of decency to such things, and these impressions are lasting impressions. They will damage a lot of, the aspects of the service life. So this is what it should be. The confluence of information, communication and entertainment should not be allowed to become a tool to convey malicious messages.
I think the problem with OTT is that it's a new medium and it's totally unregulated. And the only regulation these OTT platforms, especially these foreign platforms like Amazon, Netflix and all, they have only one rule, and that is that the program must not be Islamophobic. Besides that, there is no regulation at all. And not being an Islamophobic program, I think this rule was made back in USA. But these Indian branches don't have any regulation. You can abuse Indian gods, you can abuse any religion of India, you can abuse the Indian Army, you can make perverted shows, you can show anything you want, but there is no regulation.
This is, however, not the first time OTT content is in the news for the wrong reasons. Earlier, the Indian Air Force raised objections against the gender discrimination shown in the movie Gunjan Saxena, The Kargil Girl, based on the life of now retired Air Force combat officer.
We had the case of Gunjan. How negative portrayal of the armed forces as misogynist, as male chauvinist pigs, and worse. Whereas the fact is, I've spent 37 years in the army. One of the greatest, the most gallant organization, which looks after women, gives deference to women. A lady enters a room and all men stand up. So, it is just not the ethos of the armed forces to be disrespectful, discourteous to women. And they show disgusting scenes like, men arm wrestling women to show them down. This is obnoxious. I've never seen it happen. So why is it that creative license is always distorted? It always amounts to spin doctoring, giving it a spin, a negative spin. Why is the spin always negative?
The film has been made using creative liberties and dramatizing the events for cinematic expressions, reads the disclaimer as the movie opens. But is this enough to allow one to deviate from facts when showing a real-life story? How far can filmmakers go in dramatizing events?
We had a little bit of an issue in Gunjan also a little while earlier. The movie was nicely made, but you brought in some too sensationalized. No, I don't mind. You have a movie where there's a love affair, there is a story you create around it, no issue. We have nothing against it. You can have personal lives of men in uniform. But when you try to belittle a service by saying that we were unfair to young girls who joined the service, which was not true. When the girls came into the Indian Armed Forces in '92, Indian Air Force was one of the first to get them in. And even today, Indian Air Force has the largest number of women among the three services.
Protocol demands that film and web series makers get the Defence Ministry's approval before creating content related to the armed forces. They have to submit the plot. Once the content is ready, it has to be screened for the services. If changes are suggested, they are expected to be adopted. But in case of content released on an OTT platform, which is unregulated in India, so little can be done.
Advancement in digital technology, we are witnessing a confluence of information, communication and entertainment, otherwise known as ICE. Now, this confluence is a multifaceted phenomenon which gives us the ability to make sure that a targeted message in a targeted form reaches a targeted audience. These can be custom built. That is the first point. The second point is that this becomes a very powerful propaganda tool, especially by the ideologically driven regimes. We have plenty of them, like the left-leaning or the other side, the extremes on either side. They use this technology to deliver their message.
In fact, they prefer if your show is more pervert, if your show attacks the Indian ethos, if it attacks Indian values, because it creates a lot of controversy, and they believe that that's how these programs work.
But where does the buck stop, with the content provider or the platform? Is self-regulation working? When portraying something as serious as the defense services, shouldn't there be clear do's and don'ts?
OTT platforms, they are a natural evolution of how the social media and the internet culture. That's the way the world is. So we are for OTT. We have freedom for expression, but freedom for expression should not be carried to a point that is saying half-truths or incorrect statements.
Government has to step in, and the armed forces have to be part of this process. That after all, they should not be negatively portrayed. You cannot afford to bring the institution of the armed forces into hatred.
There has been a definitive surge in Indians taking new subscriptions on various content streaming services, and according to a recent survey, more than 75% of Indians have purchased new subscriptions for OTT platforms during the lockdown period. Is it now time to regulate OTT content?